It was just about 10 months ago, on February the 24th, that Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a, quote, special military operation to, quote, denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. What was, in fact, a massive, brutal, illegal invasion by a nuclear great power against its much smaller neighbor. It's hard to remember now just how bleak the forecasts were for Ukraine back then. Just weeks before the invasion, General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told lawmakers on Capitol Hill that it would take the Russians 3 days to seize the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, and that Volodymyr Zelensky, the comedian turned president of Ukraine, would be swiftly deposed or even killed. You know how that turned out? I think we all do. Despite the death and destruction, despite the millions of refugees fleeing the war zone, Kyiv still stands, and so does Zelensky, who was seen giving an interview that aired just the other day to David Letterman in a busy metro station in Kyiv. This is the big story of 2022, that Ukraine is not just surviving, but by many accounts, it is winning. Last month, an analysis by the New York Times found that Ukraine had recovered 54%, more than half of the land captured by Russia since the war began. Both the British and the US military now say more than 100,000 Russian troops have died, been injured or deserted in the fighting, a phenomenal number. And on Monday, the British Defence Minister estimated that Russia has lost 4,500 tanks and armoured vehicles, 63 jets, 70 helicopters, 150 drones, 12 ships and hundreds of artillery pieces, all in less than a year of combat. Now, Ukrainian forces are even going on the offensive against Russian positions in the east as winter sets in. And while Russia increasingly relies on poorly trained conscripts and mercenaries and burns through its munitions faster than it can replenish them, the Ukrainians have proved us all wrong. But to be fair, Ukrainian guests on this show told us all year how this would play out.
So we stop him here on our territory, and we destroy Russian forces here. And we've been doing that effectively, by the way.
And if somebody wishes you death, there's only so far that you can run before you have to face them. So why not face them at home? And we're Ukrainians like that. I mean, if there's a threat, you won't see our back, you'll see our face.
The mood in Ukraine right now is absolutely fantastic. People not only have hope that we will regain all our territories, people know it. Same way as we knew it at the day one of the war, that we will be fighting and that at some point we will take what is ours, restore our sovereignty and free our people.
Astounding. Just an incredible story of defiance against the odds, against an authoritarian, imperialistic regime, against war crimes. But hold on, because most of the questions that plagued Ukraine and the West at the start of this conflict are sadly still unanswered. Ukrainians say this only ends with all the Russians leaving all of Ukraine's territory. But how and when can that actually happen? And is there an off-ramp to negotiations anywhere to be found? What should be the level of US commitment to Ukraine, especially as an incoming Republican House majority threatens to cut current levels of aid to Ukraine? And it's not just in the US where future aid is at stake. How long will international attention remain focused on Ukraine before war fatigue sets in? Has it already set in? And finally, what is Vladimir Putin's real endgame now? At every setback, every failure, the Russian authoritarian leader has doubled down on his invasion, threatened war with nuclear missiles and dirty bombs. As winter bogs down both forces on both sides, and as Putin is faced with a stalemate or even a retreat, how willing is he to push that button? This week, Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, answered that question with a light-hearted jab at his Russian counterpart.
Друга частина питання, чи є загроза ядерного удару від Путіна. Я бачив його, і я бачив його бажання жити. Він дуже любить це життя. А він любить життя. Він навіть сидить довгий стіл, він сидить, боїться від ковіду захворіти, або ще від чогось. Це говорить про те, що він боїться смерті, він любить життя. Тож я не впевнений, що він готовий застосувати ядерну зброю.
I mean, it's kind of funny what he says, and it doesn't seem inaccurate. But with the fate of Ukraine, Russia, and arguably the world on the line, it's time to revisit all of these questions and ask at the end of this year, when and how does the killing end? Joining me now are Julia Ioffe, founding partner and Washington correspondent for Puck, and Anatol Lieven, senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Both of them have covered Russia and Ukraine throughout their long careers and have talked about these issues on this show. So welcome back to you both at the end of the year. You both came on the show back in February when the war began, or on the eve of war. So Julia, I want to put this to you first and then to Anatol. Julia, did you see where we would be today in December 2022? How surprised, how shocked are you to find where we are right now, to see the situation Ukraine is in?
Yeah, I did not foresee this. I was really hoping against hope that Russia wouldn't do this, that Putin wouldn't invade, because, I mean, as we've seen, his decision to invade Ukraine was based on completely flawed assumptions, on the assumptions that Ukrainians are basically Russians pretending to be Ukrainian, that Ukraine is a made-up country with a made-up culture, made-up language, made-up identity, and that Ukrainians would welcome the Russians with open arms, and that the Ukrainian government would fold and the Ukrainian army would fold. Obviously, that hasn't happened, but I did not expect that the Ukrainian army would still be fighting, that they would be winning. Yeah. And that we'd still be here today. It's absolutely astounding. And the Ukrainian people, I mean, they're, the people of the year in my book.
Anatol, same question to you. How surprised are you by the ground situation in Ukraine today?
Well, I did not expect, actually, the Russians to try to take Kiev, because it was clear to me, and I thought to Russian intelligence, that there would be tremendous Ukrainian resistance. So I thought that Putin would stop at trying to take eastern and southern Ukraine, Russia, where you have a population of Russian speakers who they could have, deluded themselves into thinking that they would support a Russian invasion. I must say, though, that, of course, Yulia is absolutely right. I mean, Putin was completely deceived by his own bad intelligence or by his own wishful thinking. But, as you pointed out at the beginning of the program, Western intelligence made the same mistake, and also thought that Ukraine would crumble very, very quickly, and offered to evacuate Zelensky because they thought Kiev would fall very quickly. So, indeed, the Ukrainians have surprised us all.
Julia, Volodymyr Zelensky recently told David Letterman that if there were no Putin, there would be no war. But let's flip that around. How different would this war be if Volodymyr Zelensky were not part of it? Is he truly instrumental to the Ukrainian resistance? Can that resistance survive if something were to happen to him? How crucial has he been to the story of this year?
I think that's been the other surprise of this war, is the strength and the competence of Zelensky's leadership. Going into this war, he was a deeply unpopular president. His approval ratings were something like 25, 28%. The Ukrainian people did not much like or approve the job he was doing. And when the war came, it turned out that the things that made him a good showman, his communication skills, his ability to get people to pay attention to him and convince them of what he was saying, proved instrumental. I do think, though, that given the egregiousness of the Russian attack, that pretty much any competent leader who stayed, who rallied his people, especially at this point, would probably do a halfway decent job, because I think so much of it is the Ukrainian people who are doing this. I think he's done a tremendous job of rallying people and keeping them united. But, the fact that he is the one that became such a competent and inspiring leader to Ukrainians, given where he was at before the war started, is also a big shock.
Anatol, you mentioned the failures of Russian intelligence and Western intelligence. What about the failures of, I don't know what to call it, geopolitical analysis? Because some, and I'm including you here, and feel free to push back, and me to an extent, probably not as far as you, but the discussions about the role of NATO in provoking this war in terms of NATO expansion and Russian grievance, that kind of disappeared very early on when Russians in the Kremlin, Putin himself, Russians in parliament, Russians on state TV to this very day, making it very clear this is less about NATO and much more about Russian imperialism, wiping Ukraine off the map. I mean, they say it all the time. They've said it all year long.
Hang on. I mean, the two are not mutually exclusive. I mean, obviously, Russia, has wished for a sphere of influence over Ukraine. But if the West had not challenged Russian interests so directly, I think that there was a chance to avoid this war. And by the way, that's not just my opinion. Read the memoir of the present head of the CIA, William Burns, in which he says several times that the US push to bring Ukraine into NATO was an absolute red line for every Russian he talked to, and that he was warned again and again that there would be a violent Russian reaction against this. So, no, I mean, you cannot simply ignore the role of Western strategy in bringing about this war. Though, of course,
Julia,
naturally, that does not excuse Putin's invasion.
Yeah, of course.
Not at all, but,
Let me bring Julia back into. Julia, isn't it interesting to you, you covered DC politics for Puck. It's been traditionally the left that has questioned foreign entanglements, foreign wars. And yet right now, the House majority coming into power in January, the Republican majority has made it very clear they're not interested in supporting Ukraine. They think it's a woke war. They think, ridiculous phrase, they think Zelensky is some kind of dictator while Putin is some kind of Democrat. A lot of the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, Matt Gaetzes of this world. But there's that lot. There's the far right. And then there's American public opinion as a whole. The war began with, the Ukrainian flag colors on the Kennedy Center in D.C., people putting Ukrainian flags on their porches. But Americans tend to have a very short attention span when it comes to foreign wars. How long, with a Republican majority in the House, as time goes by, how long do you think American support for Ukraine sustained?
Well, I think isolationism is a very American feature of both the left and the right. Of course, you're seeing it much more on the right now with the MAGA movement. And it's echoed on both sides of the pond. What you're seeing on Fox News, what you're hearing on Fox News, you often hear on Kremlin State TV about how this war is actually not about NATO and not about Russian imperialism, but is actually about fighting the idea that instead of mom and dad, we'll have parent number one and parent number two, in Putin's own words. But I actually think that because Americans generally support this war, and actually because of their short attention spans, that support for Ukraine, given the direct military spending, is actually going to be pretty much okay, given the mainstream of both political parties. And given the fact that much of the spending that the U.S. is allocating to Ukraine is actually coming back directly to America. These are American-made weapons that are made in American factories with American workers. This is creating jobs back in the U.S., some of them in the red estates. For example, Javelins are made in Troy, Alabama, which is a county that Trump carried by 20 points in 2020. They're going to have to double up their factory space and hire more workers. So I don't know. Sounds like support for Ukraine is pretty good for MAGA.
It's interesting because the polls show that Americans support Ukraine overwhelmingly still, but the polls also show that Americans also support the idea of a diplomatic settlement, which has been controversial this year when some in the Democratic Party have raised it. Anatol, last word to you. You recently co-authored a paper warning that Russia's losses in Ukraine are a catastrophic success for the West. Explain that briefly, but also explain to me how you see any kind of diplomatic negotiations, given as you yourself conceded, Putin's behaved outrageously and has deluded himself at many times.
Well, I have always supported aid, military aid and economic aid to Ukraine in this war. But that does not exclude, in the end, the possibility of a negotiated settlement. After all, as President Biden has said, as even Zelensky said earlier in the war, most wars end with a negotiated settlement. It's just, the question of along what lines. I do think from this point of view, it's worth remembering that the most important issue has been settled due to the tremendous courage of the Ukrainian armed forces, the solidarity of the Ukrainian people with Western support. The point is that, the question at the beginning was indeed, would Ukraine survive as a truly independent state, or would it once again become a satellite of Russia? And then the second question, would Ukraine lose perhaps a third or half its territory? to Russia. Now, both of those have been settled. This simply is not going to happen because of Russian defeats. So what we are now talking about is actually fairly small areas of territory in eastern and southern Ukraine, some of which were previously part of Russia in the case of Crimea, others of which have been held by Russia since 2014. Now that, to me, raises the possibility, eventually, of an agreement that does not actually betray Ukraine.